By 1940, the Wehrmacht had conquered most of Western Europe with a military machine that seemed unstoppable. At the heart of this machine was German engineering, a source of immense national pride that stretched back generations. German tanks, aircraft, and vehicles were considered the finest in the world, products of a nation that had quite literally invented the automobile itself. Karl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler had created the first practical automobiles in Germany, and German engineers never let the world forget it. When German intelligence officers examined reports about American military preparations, they found little cause for concern. The United States had been slow to rearm, its military was small by European standards, and its automotive industry seemed focused entirely on civilian comfort. American cars were big, soft, and designed for smooth highways. German officers reviewing these reports dismissed American military potential with casual contempt. The Kübelwagen, Germany's primary light military vehicle, embodied the German engineering philosophy perfectly. Designed by the legendary Ferdinand Porsche himself and built by Volkswagen, it was essentially a militarized version of the Beetle, adapted with remarkable efficiency for the demands of mobile warfare. The vehicle was simple, reliable, and specifically engineered for the rigors of combat operations. Its air-cooled engine could operate in extreme temperatures without the vulnerability of a water cooling system. Its lightweight construction allowed it to be manhandled out of difficult situations when necessary. German officers pointed to the Kübelwagen as proof of their automotive superiority, a perfect blend of practicality and engineering elegance. When they looked at American civilian automobiles, with their chrome trim, plush interiors, and emphasis on comfort over capability, they saw no threat. What could the Americans possibly build to match German military engineering? Their civilian cars were large, heavy, thirsty for fuel, and designed exclusively for paved roads and comfortable journeys. This German confidence was not entirely unfounded. German industry had been preparing for war for years under the Nazi rearmament program, while American factories still churned out refrigerators, washing machines, and comfortable sedans for domestic consumers. The German military had tested their equipment extensively across Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries. They knew intimately what worked in combat conditions and what failed. Their logistics systems had been refined through actual battlefield experience. American vehicles, designed for smooth highways and comfortable suburban commutes, seemed laughably inadequate for the mud, sand, rocks, and mountains of a world at war. German commanders reviewing intelligence reports about American military development dismissed any concerns with a shrug. The rough terrain of the European battlefield, they were certain, would destroy any American vehicle within weeks of deployment. The sand of Africa would clog their engines, the mud of Russia would swallow them whole. German engineers had designed for these conditions. Americans designed for comfort. The confidence seemed entirely justified. They were about to make one of the greatest miscalculations of the entire war.
In June 1940, as German forces paraded triumphantly through Paris and the world watched in shock, the United States Army quietly issued one of the most demanding specifications in automotive history. They wanted a light reconnaissance vehicle weighing no more than 1,300 pounds, yet capable of carrying a 600-pound payload, including a driver and passenger. The wheelbase had to be under 80 inches for maximum maneuverability. It needed four-wheel drive to traverse any terrain, a fold-down windshield for a low profile, and the structural strength to mount a machine gun. Most impossibly, they wanted a working prototype delivered in just 49 days. The major American automakers looked at these requirements and considered them absurd. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler all had engineering departments that could theoretically design such a vehicle, but the timeline was impossible. The weight requirement alone seemed to defy physics. These companies politely declined to bid on the contract, considering it a waste of their engineering resources. The Army's ambitious specifications seemed destined to die on the drawing board. American Bantam, a struggling small car company from Butler, Pennsylvania, saw an opportunity where the giants saw only problems. Bantam was barely surviving, having produced only a few thousand cars in recent years. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Their chief engineer, a freelance consultant named Karl Probst, was brought in for what seemed like an impossible task. Working with furious intensity, Probst sketched the initial design in just 2 days and nights, barely sleeping. The entire company threw itself into the project, working around the clock in shifts. When other engineers said it couldn't be done, Bantam's small team simply worked harder. They delivered their prototype, affectionately called the Blitz buggy, with just hours to spare before the deadline. Army testers at Camp Holabird were immediately impressed by what they saw. This strange little vehicle could climb grades that would stop a conventional truck. It could ford streams that would drown other vehicles. It could carry loads far exceeding what its slight frame suggested possible. The Bantam prototype passed every test the Army threw at it. But Bantam was simply too small to meet the Army's production demands. The company could barely produce a few thousand vehicles a year, and the military would need hundreds of thousands. In a controversial decision that remains debated by historians, the Army shared Bantam's design with Willys-Overland and Ford, inviting them to submit their own prototypes. Willys-Overland's contribution would prove decisive. Their Go Devil engine, a 60-horsepower four-cylinder marvel designed by Barney Roos, gave the vehicle the power-to-weight ratio that would make it legendary. This engine was simple enough that a mechanic with basic tools could rebuild it in the field, yet tough enough to run for thousands of miles with minimal maintenance. It produced more torque at low speeds than any comparable engine, perfect for crawling over obstacles. By 1941, the final design was standardized, incorporating the best elements from all three companies, and mass production began at a staggering pace. The vehicle's official designation was the Willys MB, but soldiers would quickly give it a name that would become immortal, the Jeep. Before the war ended, over 640,000 would roll off assembly lines, becoming the most produced American military vehicle of the conflict. November 1942 brought Operation Torch to the shores of North Africa, and with the American forces came thousands of their new Jeeps. German and Italian troops, watching the Allied landings through binoculars, were initially unimpressed by what they observed. The small American vehicles looked almost toy-like compared to their own equipment. Tiny and seemingly fragile machines that couldn't possibly survive the brutal conditions of desert warfare. Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps had been fighting in this unforgiving terrain for nearly 2 years. They knew intimately how the desert destroyed machines and men alike. The abrasive sand worked its way into every mechanism. The extreme temperature swings from freezing nights to scorching days stressed metal and rubber beyond their limits. The vast distances and lack of roads demanded vehicles of exceptional reliability. The Afrika Korps had watched countless vehicles succumb to these conditions, from Italian trucks to captured British equipment. Surely these little American cars, these toy-like Jeeps, would fare no better. German officers expected to see them broken down and abandoned within weeks. Within weeks of the American arrival, German reconnaissance reports began noting something unexpected, something that didn't fit their assumptions. The American Jeeps weren't breaking down in the numbers they had predicted. They weren't getting stuck in the soft sand that trapped heavier vehicles. In fact,
These strange little machines were going places that German vehicles simply couldn't follow. The Jeep's remarkably lightweight and sophisticated four-wheel drive system allowed it to float over soft sand that would trap heavier German vehicles up to their axles. Where a Kübelwagen would dig itself deeper with every attempt to escape, a Jeep would simply crawl out and continue on its way. The Jeep's simple mechanical systems meant that when something did eventually break, and in the desert everything eventually breaks, soldiers could fix it with basic tools and commonly available parts. Afrika Korps officers began requesting detailed reports on these American vehicles. What they learned surprised them. The Jeeps were everywhere, performing roles that German commanders hadn't even imagined possible for such a small vehicle. The Afrika Korps began capturing Jeeps in increasing numbers, and German engineers eagerly examined these prizes. What they found inside surprised them even more than the vehicle's battlefield performance had suggested. The Jeep's design was elegantly simple in a way that German engineering rarely achieved. Every component served multiple purposes. Nothing was wasted. The body panels could be removed in minutes for repairs. The engine was accessible from multiple angles. Spare parts were interchangeable across the entire production run. German engineers who examined captured Jeeps reported back to Berlin that the Americans had achieved something remarkable, a vehicle that was simultaneously primitive and deeply sophisticated. It used no advanced technology, no exotic materials, nothing that German industry couldn't easily replicate. Yet its basic design was nearly perfect for military use. The simplicity that German engineers had initially dismissed as crude was actually a feature, not a flaw. Erwin Rommel himself is reported to have admitted that he wished his forces had something comparable. The Desert Fox recognized quality when he saw it. The tide of opinion in German military circles was slowly beginning to turn. The Italian campaign of 1943 would reveal the Jeep's most impressive capability, one that would leave German mountain troops shaking their heads in disbelief. Italy's terrain was a nightmare for military vehicles. Steep mountain roads, hairpin turns with sheer drops, muddy tracks that became rivers in the rain, and grades that seemed to defy automotive physics. German engineers had always considered this terrain to be infantry and mule country, places where wheeled vehicles simply could not operate effectively. The Wehrmacht's own vehicles struggled on Italian mountain roads. Heavy trucks couldn't navigate the tight turns. Even the nimble Kübelwagen found its limits on the steepest grades, its rear-engine design causing the front wheels to lose traction on extreme inclines. German commanders assumed the Americans would face the same limitations, perhaps even worse given their apparent lack of experience with European terrain. What they witnessed instead would fundamentally challenge their assumptions about what a wheeled vehicle could accomplish. American Jeeps began climbing grades that German engineers had declared impossible for wheeled vehicles. The combination of the torque-rich Go Devil engine, the low center of gravity, the optimal weight distribution, and the sophisticated four-wheel drive system gave the Jeep capabilities that seemed almost supernatural to observers. German mountain troops, elite soldiers trained in alpine warfare, watched in amazement as American Jeeps crawled up slopes where even their mules hesitated. The vehicles seemed to grip the terrain like mountain goats, hence the nickname that soldiers on both sides began using. On one memorable occasion, American forces demonstrated a Jeep climbing a 60-degree grade that German vehicle experts had sworn was physically impossible. The Jeep's approach and departure angles, combined with its remarkable traction, allowed it to summit terrain that would defeat vehicles many times its size. German officers began requesting detailed technical analyses of the Jeep's suspension and drivetrain.
trying to understand how the Americans had solved engineering challenges that had stumped German designers. German engineers who captured and examined jeeps in Italy conducted detailed investigations, trying desperately to understand how such a simple vehicle achieved such remarkable performance. The answers were frustratingly simple. The Jeep's short wheelbase gave it exceptional maneuverability that longer German vehicles couldn't match. Its lightweight, which German engineers had initially dismissed as a structural weakness, was actually its greatest strength in difficult terrain. A lighter vehicle put less pressure on soft ground and required less power to climb steep grades. The Go Devil engine's torque characteristics were perfectly matched to low-speed, high-load situations like mountain climbing. The transfer case and differential gearing had been specifically optimized for off-road performance rather than highway speed. Every design choice that had seemed simplistic or even crude to German eyes was revealed to be a deliberate engineering decision optimized for a specific purpose. The Americans hadn't stumbled onto a good design by accident. They had engineered brilliance through intentional simplicity. It was a philosophy fundamentally different from German engineering tradition, and it was working spectacularly well. June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy. As the largest amphibious invasion in history unfolded, jeeps were among the first vehicles to hit the beaches behind the initial assault waves. Some were driven directly off landing craft into the surf. Others were dropped by glider behind enemy lines. The versatility of the Jeep had made it indispensable to Allied planning. These small vehicles could be loaded onto virtually any transport, from massive landing ships to fragile gliders. They could operate immediately upon landing without the complex preparation that heavier vehicles required. Within hours of the initial landings, Jeeps were racing inland, carrying commanders to observe the battle, evacuating wounded soldiers to aid stations, and hauling ammunition to troops in contact with the enemy. German defenders watching the invasion unfold noted with concern how quickly American forces achieved mobility. While German reinforcements struggled to move through Allied air interdiction, American jeeps seemed to be everywhere at once, exploiting every gap in the German lines. The breakout from Normandy revealed just how central the jeep had become to American military operations. General George Patton's Third Army raced across France at a pace that stunned German commanders, and jeeps were at the forefront of every advance. They served as the eyes of the army, conducting reconnaissance that kept commanders informed of enemy positions. They served as the nervous system, carrying orders and messages when radio communication was unreliable. They served as the bloodstream, rushing critical supplies to units that had outrun their logistics trains. Patton himself was frequently seen in his personal jeep, racing between units to personally direct operations. The German strategy of trading space for time to rebuild their lines was undermined by the sheer mobility of American forces, mobility that was built on a foundation of hundreds of thousands of jeeps. Wehrmacht officers ruefully noted that American units seemed to move at twice the speed their logistics should have allowed, and the jeep was the reason. As Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the jeep proved equally vital in the war's final campaigns. The terrible winter of 1944-45, with its brutal cold and deep snow, would have immobilized a lesser vehicle. But jeeps fitted with chains and winterization kits continued operating when German vehicles froze solid. American mechanics had become experts at keeping their jeeps running under any conditions. The simplicity of the design meant that field repairs were possible even in combat conditions. A skilled mechanic could change a jeep's engine in under 4 hours. Spare parts were standardized and abundant. German prisoners of war often expressed amazement at how many jeeps they saw and how they all seemed to be running. Their own experience with German vehicles was of constant mechanical failures and shortage of parts. The contrast told the story of two very different industrial philosophies, and which one was winning the war. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Jeep had become the very symbol of American military might and industrial capability. While the Jeep was proving itself across Europe, it faced an entirely different set of challenges in the Pacific theater. The island-hopping campaign from Guadalcanal to Okinawa presented conditions that seemed specifically designed to destroy military vehicles, crushing humidity that promoted rust and rot, torrential tropical rains that turned ground into bottomless mud, dense jungle that blocked roads and concealed enemy ambushers, volcanic sand that ground down mechanical components, salt air and salt water that corroded everything metal. Japanese defenders watching American landings expected the small vehicles they saw coming ashore to quickly succumb to these brutal conditions, just as so many other pieces of equipment had. But the Jeeps kept running. Their simple, robust design that had been created with European battlefields in mind proved remarkably adaptable to Pacific conditions. Mechanics developed tropical maintenance routines, and the vehicles responded by performing reliably month after month in conditions that destroyed more complex machines. The Jeep's role in the Pacific extended far beyond simple transportation. Marines and Army troops modified their Jeeps for dozens of specialized roles that their designers had never imagined. Jeeps were fitted with stretcher racks to serve as ambulances, racing wounded men from frontline aid stations to field hospitals faster than any alternative. They were mounted with multiple machine guns and used as mobile fire support platforms, racing into ambushes with guns blazing. They were adapted as communications vehicles, mobile command posts, and even makeshift fire trucks. On islands where every piece of equipment had to be shipped thousands of miles, the Jeep's versatility was invaluable. One vehicle could fill roles that would otherwise require 3 or 4 specialized machines. Logistics officers loved them for this flexibility. Ground commanders loved them for their reliability. Medical officers loved them for saving lives. The Jeep had become far more than a reconnaissance vehicle. It had become the Swiss Army knife of the American military. Japanese military intelligence took note of the ubiquitous American Jeeps with growing concern. In their own forces, vehicles were scarce and specialized, each type dedicated to a specific function and irreplaceable when lost. The Americans seemed to have an endless supply of these versatile little machines, and they used them for everything. Japanese after-action reports frequently mentioned the mobility advantage that Jeeps gave to American forces, allowing them to rapidly concentrate firepower at unexpected points and to evacuate wounded before they could be overrun. Captured Japanese documents revealed a growing awareness that American industrial might, symbolized by the endless stream of Jeeps, represented a fundamental strategic advantage that Japanese industry simply couldn't match. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was proof of a manufacturing capability that was outproducing the entire Axis combined. When American forces finally occupied Japan in 1945, they arrived in Jeeps, and the Japanese people saw firsthand the machine that had helped defeat them. As the war drew to a close, German military professionals began conducting their own assessments of what had gone wrong. Among the topics that received significant attention was the surprising effectiveness of American military equipment, and the Jeep was frequently mentioned in these discussions. German staff officers who had spent years dismissing American industrial capabilities were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The simple little vehicle they had mocked in 1940 had proven itself one of the most effective military machines of the war. Captured German documents and post-war interviews reveal the evolution of German thinking about the Jeep. Initial dismissal gave way to grudging respect, which eventually transformed into open admiration. Senior Wehrmacht officers admitted that they had fundamentally misunderstood American engineering philosophy. Where German designers pursued complexity and theoretical perfection, Americans pursued simplicity and practical effectiveness. The Jeep represented a design philosophy that was foreign to German thinking, and it had worked brilliantly. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, offered particularly insightful comments on American production methods in his post-war interrogations and memoirs. Speer had been responsible for Germany's industrial war effort and had watched helplessly as American production overwhelmed his best efforts. He noted that American factories could produce Jeeps at a rate that German industry couldn't match for any comparable vehicle. More importantly, the Jeep's standardized design meant that every vehicle was identical, interchangeable, and easy to maintain. German military vehicles, by contrast, came in dozens of variations, each requiring different parts and different training. A German mechanic needed to master multiple systems. An American mechanic could learn the Jeep and maintain any of the hundreds of thousands in service. This standardization, which German engineers had dismissed as a lack of sophistication, was actually a massive strategic advantage. Speer admitted that Germany had been outthought as well as outproduced. Perhaps the most significant testament to German reassessment of the Jeep came from their engineering community. Post-war German automotive engineers, including some who had worked on military vehicle projects during the war, openly praised the Jeep's design. They admitted that German engineers had been blinded by their own success, so confident in their superiority that they couldn't recognize excellence when it came from an unexpected source. The Jeep taught them that engineering brilliance isn't always about complexity. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution is the simplest one that works reliably under all conditions. This lesson would influence post-war German automotive design, contributing to the philosophy that would eventually produce some of the world's most reliable vehicles. The mockery of 1940 had transformed into the sincerest form of flattery, imitation. German engineers spent the post-war years studying American production methods and design philosophies, trying to understand how a nation of supposed automotive amateurs had produced something so effective. The Jeep had changed how the world thought about military vehicle design. The Jeep's influence extended far beyond World War II. When peace came in 1945, surplus military Jeeps flooded civilian markets around the world. Farmers discovered that these rugged little vehicles were perfect for agricultural work, able to traverse muddy fields and pull equipment that would defeat conventional vehicles. Hunters and outdoor enthusiasts found them ideal for reaching remote locations. Construction companies used them on job sites. The Jeep's wartime reputation for reliability translated directly into civilian success. Willys recognized this potential and began producing civilian versions, launching an entirely new category of vehicle, the recreational off-roader. Every SUV on the road today owes something to the original Jeep design. The vehicle that German engineers had dismissed as a crude military tool became the grandfather of an entire automotive segment worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. The Jeep's DNA lives on in vehicles that its original designers could never have imagined. Military forces around the world took note of the Jeep's success and demanded similar vehicles for their own use. The Soviet Union had received thousands of Jeeps through Lend-Lease and was so impressed that they created their own version, the Gaz-67. British forces developed the Land Rover, explicitly inspired by the Jeep's capabilities. Japanese manufacturers, having seen what Jeeps could do during the occupation, developed their own light four-wheel drive vehicles. The influence spread to every continent. Decades after World War II ended, military procurement officers were still using the Jeep as the benchmark against which all light utility vehicles were measured. A vehicle had to demonstrate that it could do what a Jeep could do before it would even be considered. The original design was so right for its purpose that the basic concept has remained essentially unchanged for 80 years. Modern military vehicles use more advanced materials and more powerful engines, but they're still recognizably descended from that original Willys MB. Today, the Jeep brand is recognized around the world, a symbol of American engineering and the spirit of adventure. The 7-slot grille that adorned those original military vehicles has become one of the most recognizable automotive design elements in history. Jeep Wranglers carry on the tradition of the original design, still offering the same basic virtues of simplicity, capability, and ruggedness that made the original so successful. They're still used by military forces around the world. They still climb mountains that other vehicles can't attempt. They still embody the design philosophy that proved so effective in 1942. Simple, tough, and perfectly suited to their purpose. Those German engineers who laughed at American automotive capability in 1940 would hardly recognize the modern Jeep lineup, but they would immediately understand its heritage. The humble quarter-ton truck that they dismissed as a toy became an icon, a legend, and proof that sometimes the simplest ideas are the most revolutionary. The Jeep didn't just help win a war, it changed the automotive world forever.